Okay, so I think my intention today is probably to do, we're in here, what's our time exactly? 12:30 to 1:50, is that correct? So I think I'll do about a half hour today, if that's okay. We're just kind of getting a little bit into chapter one so that we feel like when we leave class today, we have some idea about what this topic even encompasses. Okay, so payroll accounting, our learning objectives for the first chapter is to really take a scan of all of the different laws that impact payroll. And at first you think about, gosh, I mean, how many of those can there be? And there's a pretty long history of laws that are directly impact income taxes, which are most often manifested through payroll. For example, obviously all of you have heard of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. Did you know that many of the tenets of Obamacare are actually affected through payroll tax and income tax? A lot of people don't realize that. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to look at record-keeping requirements, and then we're going to look at how payroll taps into an HR department. And different sort of records, and then we're just going to take a really brief look at a payroll register and employee earnings record. Okay, so the first point that I'd like to make is that payroll professionals are really well compensated. They are elevated at, not at a bachelor's level, but at an associate's level. Their ability to process some of the most confidential and complex transactions in an organization has really elevated their compensation in recent years. And of course, these are always national numbers, which don't really apply in Montana. You've got to apply a hefty discount to any wage numbers that are taken annually. But payroll manager salaries ranging from a 71 to 124,000 in 2018 numbers. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and start by putting up a scan of some different laws and just seeing if you've heard of any of these. And then, of course, I'll go through and describe each of them one by one. So has anybody heard of the Fair Labor Standards Act? Do you know what that is? It's really big. Go ahead. So it gives us all sorts of important direction, like minimum wage, child labor laws, overtime mandates, right? Fair Labor Standards Act. I'm going to go through each of these in a lot of detail, so we're just kind of doing an overview right now. FICA, Federal Insurance Contribution Act. Okay, you're thinking of FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance, which is on our bank accounts. Very close. It's got a lot of the same words. Anybody ever seen FICA on their paychecks? You know what it is, Amanda? It is. Anybody dial in a little bit more? What kind of federal tax? Is it income tax? It is Social Security. That's a piece of it. Social Security and Medicare. It's always interesting to me to see how many students or just people in general don't check their paychecks or like know what's on their paychecks. Like there's all these withholdings. What are they? Where do they go? How do I read it? I have people come all the time at the end of the year with their W-2 and they're like, am I going to get all this money back? You know, I mean, that's not a good example, but just my goal is at the end of the semester, you know, not that you're going to be some sophisticated tax preparer, but that you can read your own W-2 and make your own choices on your W-4 that make sense for you. I mean, right now, collectively, probably as students, I would imagine that many of you are high income or, you know, so it's pretty self-explanatory what you're going to do on your W-4, but as your situations change, your income levels change, you maybe, you know, get married or divorced or have kids or dependents, you know, you've got to be able to maneuver that and make good financial decisions, you know, for yourself. So we're really going to be looking at that. Yeah, so FICA is the name of the piece of legislation that promulgated or put forth Social Security and Medicare. And then of course we have income tax withholding laws, federal and state. In Montana, we don't have any local, well, that's not true. In Missoula, we don't have any local taxes. Some localities do have taxes, like Whitefish has got a local tax. That's the only example I know of that has a local tax in Montana, but there may be others. It's not a sales tax. It's actually a occupancy tax. So if I go to stay in a hotel or a B&B or ski or eat there, it's their way to extract a couple extra bucks from tourists. So I guess it's a pseudo sales tax. Stays in the community. We don't have one here. Yes. Unemployment tax acts, and there's one at the federal and one at the state level. We're going to look at that. Where do you get your unemployment compensation benefits if you become unemployed? And who put the money into that in the first place for you to get it out if you need it? So we're going to look at that whole cycle. Fair employment laws, we're going to look at everything from civil rights to disability discrimination to age discrimination, gender discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination. All comes under this big umbrella called fair employment. And then there's just another sort of big, broad area called other. And then state laws. Okay, FLSA. FLSA was passed in 1938. Anybody know who was president in 1938 or what that was a part of a package of? History. 1938, just pre-World War II. Yeah, FDR, right? So, president for 4 terms before we had limited terms, right? FLSA was part of the New Deal. You hear a lot of conversation with the current political situation where the House of Representatives just flipped in the last election. A lot of the young Congress people are talking about the Green New Deal, which is going back to Roosevelt's New Deal and tweaking it for a green or a sustainable revolution. So, and they're pulling a lot of their economic and political theory from what we're going to be talking about in here, which is core caveats of the New Deal that FDR brought forth. So the Fair Labor Standard Act, super important. First time in American history where there was a minimum wage or overtime or a 40-hour work week or the concept that you couldn't employ an 8-year-old. We were watching a Christmas movie, escapes my name, the name escapes me, doesn't matter, set in the turn of the century, maybe 1908, 1910, in Brooklyn, where lots of young immigrant kids, Polish kids and Irish kids, and were working as like in blacksmith factories and metal factories and just these abysmal conditions, right? I mean, it was essentially child slavery. So I think like in this day and age, we have a tendency to think of that as like sweatshop labor in countries that we can't find on a map. But I mean, that existed in this country just a little over 100 years ago, right? This was the first time that child labor was outlawed. So that's not that long ago, 80 years ago. Equal pay for equal work. And one of these bottom bullets is pretty important. It says that for the first time, with the passage of FLSA, that payroll records had to be maintained. In other words, prior to this, if it was like, you're saying, hey, you're disputing, like, I thought I worked 60 hours last week, you've got to pay me for all those. And I'm like, oh yeah, well, I only showed that you worked 30 and I already threw away the records, or I shredded the records, or I don't have great records. That's not an option anymore. You're required by law to keep your tax records, your payroll tax records, and your payroll records, compensation records for 7 years. So if there's ever any contention, that it's the onus is on me as an employer to come forth with the documentation. FICA. So FICA is comprised of 2 separate taxes. FICA was the core of the New Deal. Prior to FICA, I mean, in this day and age, we'd call this socialism. But prior to FICA, there was no safety nets in America. No social safety nets. If you became unemployed, that sucks. Became disabled, too bad, right? You retired and you didn't have enough money after working for a company for 50 years and they didn't take care of you, that's a bummer, right? That's pretty much how it looked prior to FICA. FICA was the first, and FDR was very much a social scientist who studied economic manifestations and behavioral traits of what happens to people when they work without any sort of social safety net. That's what FICA was. And for the first time it said, if you retire or become disabled, or if the earner in your family dies, the government's going to give you a stipend to keep you solvent and help you pay your bills, right? Social security. And the second piece of that was Medicare, which basically, as we all know, provides for a healthcare system for our impoverished or retired people. Okay? So those have fancy names. Under FICA, they're not called Social Security and Medicare. They're called OASDI and HI. And yes, you have to know these. OASDI stands for old age, right? That's the retirement piece. Disability, that's the I become permanently disabled. And survivor's insurance. Survivor being I'm 14 and my mom doesn't work and my dad's the major earner and my dad dies. My mom's going to get checks because I'm an underage survivor. Okay. Old age survivors and disability insurance, OASDI. That was a key, we call it Social Security. Most people don't know it's really called OASDI. Anybody have any idea how much we pay into that out of your paycheck? How much do you think?
Is it like 20, 30 bucks?
It's not a dollar amount, it's a percentage. Close. Very, very close. It is OASDI is 6.2%. Now I'm going to have to get a whole batch. See that? These are both going in the trash. OASDI is 6.2%, and that comes out of your paycheck based on your gross wages. But what's interesting about it is it's also matched by your employer. So next time you get a paycheck, you go see if you made 200 bucks, you should have $12.40 taken out of it. Right? 6.2% of your gross wages. Then, whoever you work for puts in another 6.2%. Pardon me. So you've got a total of 12.4% of every dollar you earn going into the Social Security system. Medicare, or HI, health insurance, is 1.45%. And that is also. So, out of the chute, all of us pay 7.65%, 7.65 cents for every dollar we earn into the big system called FICA. And our employer matches that. And if you're self-employed, you pay all that. So if I decide I don't want to be a professor, I want to be a consultant full-time. One of the things I immediately have to think about is, oh my gosh, I've got to pay that employer share of FICA, another 7.65%. So that's definitely something to consider. And this happens a lot. I'll get small. I just got this new client that's a diesel mechanic down the valley. And like a lot of guys and gals around here, they're not making a ton of money, and they're self-employed. They've got a little business, out of their shed out back. and, you know, they make 15 grand a year, let's say. And they don't really make enough to pay income tax. We'll talk about that in a little bit, what those levels are. They don't have enough income to pay income tax, but they've got to pay 15.3% of that $15,000 in FICA. So do that math in your head real quick. That's $2,200. It's a guy that makes 15 grand of it sitting in his savings account? Hell no. So those are the kinds of things also that I hope that you can take away from this class, is like how to be astute about planning, doing business planning, like, oh my gosh, I've got to absorb all this overhead myself. And in addition to your own insurance and your own pension and your own unemployment taxes, your own workers' comp and all this, boy, howdy, you know, it's all of a sudden, you know, you've got to be making a lot more sometimes than you think. Okay, I think I've said everything I have to say there. We're going to be doing a lot of work with this. Income tax withholding. So this again is federal, state, and local. Federal income tax system just got a major overhaul. December 17th, 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed. It's pretty interesting. I'm just starting to, I've done some conference and workshops on it last year, and I'm just getting my first clients. Data started to preliminarily get it input and see what's happening. I think what the American people are going to find is that it's going to be an interesting tax season. Let's just leave it at that. I think a lot of people changed their W-4s in February, March, thinking that they were going to get big tax cuts, and I think there'll be some interesting scenarios. So, I think people are going to owe money. I don't think they're going to owe money because they've been getting more money on their take-home pay, which was the intention of the administration, to give a really quick stimulus to the economy. So it looks really good. I think there's going to be some very unhappy people. So we'll see. The corporate tax cuts were made permanent. The individual tax cuts are temporary. They phase out between now and 2022. So people don't know that either. State and local income tax in Montana, of course, we have state income tax. Our highest marginal tax bracket in Montana is 6%. And we're kind of in the middle of the pack as far as states that tax. We're not super high, but we're certainly not in the lower tier either. And then there's 6 states that don't have state income tax at all. So how do their governments raise money? Sales tax and very high property taxes. So we don't have a sales tax. We have a property tax and an income tax. Government's got to raise money somehow. Texas doesn't have a state income tax. Delaware, Washington, Nevada, Hawaii, look at the 6. But they've got obviously then they've got high sales tax and property taxes. So money comes from somewhere. And we'll look at our state income tax system in the state portion of the class. Unemployment Tax Act. So there's 2 of them, FUTA and SUTA. The Federal Unemployment Tax Act was also passed as part of the New Deal. 1935, 36, somewhere in there. And it's a tax that's paid by your employer. You don't pay it out of your paycheck. And it's really small. It's negligible. It's 0.6%, so it's really, really small. So FUTA is not where your actual unemployment compensation benefits come from. If you become unemployed, do you file a claim with the feds or with the state? State. So the only thing that the feds do is that tax that we pay to the feds for FUTA is to oversee all of the SUTA programs to make sure they're compliant, they're statutorily sound, which means they comply with laws, and that they're solvent. I don't know if any of you heard this during the recession, a number of states became insolvent, like Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, which meant they didn't have the money to make their unemployment benefit payments. So it's like, oh my gosh, double whammy. I'm unemployed. I'm relying on the state to get, a fraction of my prior earnings, right? I used to be bringing them $800 a week. I'm relying on the state to give me $320 a week to live on. And now the state's like, oh, sorry, we're belly up, right? So then the feds have to step in. So that's all part of this system. So for as much as people hate government, many of us rely on it, again, for a social net, right? Safety net. And then SUTA is different in every state. Montana's state unemployment laws look very different from Idaho's, look different from North Dakota's. There's different rates, there's different caps, there's different benefit amounts. So that looks different for every state. But that second little bullet under there basically talks about what I was talking about before, which is statutory soundness. In other words, it looks different from state to state, but you still have to comply with certain parameters or levels or limits. In other words, I can't say like, in Montana, if you become unemployed, I'm not going to pay out any more than $80 a week to you. Well, that's not living wage, so that's not doable. So there's limits. Fair employment laws. Obviously, the granddaddy was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Who signed the Civil Rights Act? History. No history buffs? Or anybody that ever went to history class in school? Who started the Civil Rights Movement? President. What president spearheaded it? JFK. But he died before it was signed. Who signed it? Huh? In between Kennedy. Big Texan guy. Come on, I'm giving you away. LBJ. Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. He was Kennedy's VP and took over when Kennedy was assassinated. Gosh, that is really a loaded question, Amanda. I would hope that we would all just know that as like students of American civics, but I guess we just showed that we didn't. So maybe I will test you. Maybe we'll throw a little history into payroll. Maybe bonus points. I like that. Interesting side story to that is that's when the South lost its, the South was very blue, a huge, reliable Democratic bloc politically until the Civil Rights Act. And they walked after the Civil Rights Act, and they've been reliably red ever since 1964. If anybody's ever wondered about that, that's what happened. And LBJ was a Texan, so he was a Southerner. So it was very, very interesting dynamics in the country at that time. And what it said, which the Southern states, they actually boycotted, and the caucus before the signing of the Civil Rights Act, was that you can't discriminate in hiring or firing or promoting or compensating based on 5 caveats, right? Are they up there? Color, race, religion, national origin, or gender. And that did not sit well in the Deep South in 1964. So there's a couple things that are conspicuously missing from here that we'll talk about. Can anybody see where subsequent fair employment law might have gone? Like what classes of people or categories weren't included in this that you could still discriminate on? Yeah, sexual orientation, LGBTQ, absolutely. What else? Age, absolutely. What else? Disabilities. And I will tell you some of all those other things we've listed. I think some of the most graphic film I've ever seen was on the disabled movement to be qualified as a non-discriminatory status. Oh, this just puts shivers through me. I almost feel like bringing this piece of footage in to show you. 1994, in the mall in front of Washington, D.C. in the mall. Anybody here ever been to D.C.? Okay, so you've been to the mall, right? And all these thousands, tens of thousands of disabled people pulling themselves out of their wheelchairs and on the ground in to get that graphic footage to say, we need to have access to buildings and bathrooms. By nature, you're discriminating against us in the employment world if we can't get into your freaking place of business, right? So there's been a lot. This was the granddaddy, but there's been tons of very compelling, necessary, provocative legislation subsequent to this. Unions were also specifically included in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that they may not exclude or segregate members. And this is also just interesting. I'm just gabbing because I can. I'm up here and you're out there. But I just finished Michelle Obama's book called Becoming. And both of her great-grandparents, great-grandfathers on either side were slaves, and one in South Carolina, one in Georgia. And they both were part of what was called the diaspora, or the migration of freed blacks from the South to the northern suburbs. They reckon it was about 6 million people between 1890 and 1920 that migrated from the South to Chicago and Omaha and Detroit, Buffalo, Albany, etc. And one of the ways that discrimination carried into the North was that they were denied access to unions. And so they were relegated to these very entry-level, go nowhere, super low paid jobs because they were denied access to unions. You had to have a union card to work as a tradesperson or as an apprentice. So it was like this, it's just all these things, that you don't think of until you read or study history. But so the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act addressed that as well. So EEO applies to all employers who have 15 or more workers in each of 20 or more weeks in a year. And then it was amended in 1991 to say, hey, if you intentionally and through malfeasance discriminate to somebody, the courts can penalize you through something called punitive damages. Do you know what that means? Punitive damages. So you know what? You didn't hire me in your company because I'm a woman. Not only have you violated my civil rights, but I'm going to punish you, and the court's going to give you a $20 million fine. Right? That's punitive. Like, it really hurts. I don't want to shut your business down, but I want it to hurt so bad that other organizations are going to look at you and say, I better get some policies and procedures in place to preclude discrimination in my shop. This is going to cost me heavily if I don't. Okay. So discrimination, intentional discrimination, punitive and compensatory. ADEA followed up the Civil Rights Act 3 years later, 1967. LBJ was still in office. He chose not to run in 1968. What was going on in the country? What were we in the middle of? Vietnam. And we had scaled up in Vietnam to a point there were massive protests, and LBJ did not run in 1968. So he only filled in that year after Kennedy died, and then that 64 to 68 term. Okay. He was still in office when ADEA was passed, and it basically says the same thing as Civil Rights Act, but you can't discriminate against me based on my age, and that's identified, I think, as 45. Is that up there? Oh, 40 or older. And there's exceptions for obvious things like safety, people that work on the railroad or pilots, or there's safety-based constraints. I can discriminate against you, or I can say I don't hire any pilots over 55 or whatever. So it's the safety industries. And then also I think there's an exception if you're in a, I can't remember how they identify it, something like a critical or a keystone position in an organization. There's some caveats around age too, but on the whole, it's a category of anti-discrimination. ADA, just what I was talking about, passed in 1994 under, who was president in 94?
It was Clinton.
Clinton was 88. Reagan left office in 88. Clinton was elected in 88. And then again, no, Bush Sr. was 88. 92, Clinton was elected. 96, Clinton was elected. Junior came in 2000. Bush Sr. was 1 term. Bush Jr. was 2. Senior was 1, 88 to 92, post-Reagan. And what ADA says, there's an interesting caveat here, a couple things. First off, it doesn't apply if you have less than 15 employees. So if I'm a little tiny mom and pop shop, I don't have to comply with ADA. A lot of times when you see stuff like this, anybody know what that's a result of when you see all these little inserts into pieces of legislation? One more time. Good guess. That's not the answer, but really good guess. It's a result of the compromise as pieces of legislation go through the House and the Senate and the subcommittees, and we hear all about how policy's crafted. It's like, employers didn't want this passed at all because, immediately they knew, widening doorways and making accessible bathrooms and bringing, workplaces down so they're accessible to people, it was cost of money. So they fought against it. Well, we're not going to win this battle, so let's insert things that say it's only for companies of 15 or more employees, or they've got to be within a 50-mile radius or something. So whenever you see weird little things like that inserted, that was a result of lobbyists and compromise. But what this says is 2 really interesting things. One is that you can't discriminate, which is the same language as we've seen in the prior 2 slides. The second really interesting thing is you as an employer are required to make reasonable accommodation to people with disabilities. Let me see this language like with students. I'm required, or the university is required, to provide you with reasonable accommodation for your disability. Okay? And does that carry a really strong connotation to you, or does that seem sort of, I don't know how to interpret it. It's a little fuzzy, and it's so fuzzy that tens of thousands of cases have honestly clogged the court since passage of this law. Because, let me throw out some examples, and then we'll call this good. So, this is a true example. Before I came back to Montana, I went to undergrad here, and spent 15 years doing grad school and living in Europe, and then working in northern Colorado as a CFO. And I was CFO of a pharmaceutical company, and we had a lab, a research lab, with lots of very expensive equipment, obviously, hoods and prototyping software, and all, just a very couple $1 million lab. And we had a gal come apply to be a microbiologist with us, and she was in a wheelchair. And she was very qualified for the job. And this was 91, pre-ADA, by 3 years. And I'm in charge of HR and finances for the company. And so I was on all the hiring committees because we were a startup. That's the other thing. We were privately held. One guy owned us, a guy from the UK. He's got his own money into the place. So small company startup. And she was the most qualified. But it was very clear that we were going to have to do some pretty significant modification to our lab to accommodate her, right? We're going to have to bring some of the benches down. We're going to have to build ramps to move her up, but then it was going to have to be removable ramps so that able-bodied people could also use that station, right? So there's a lot going on with it, okay? So that was 1991. We actually chose to do what was the right and ethical thing and hire the most qualified person, which was this young lady, and make the accommodations. Okay? But we didn't have to. Now, 1994 comes, pass ADA. Would that be required reasonable accommodation for a startup? We're not even in the revenue phase. We're still doing, all we're doing is burning through cash doing research. Fine. How many employees? What's your revenue potential? How well capitalized are you? Are you going to go public and have public investment in this? There's a million questions around it, right? Okay, here's another example. University of Montana. Obviously our buildings are all accessible, right? When our elevators work. Makes me crazy. Is it reasonable to expect that as a professor applying to the University of Montana that I would be accommodated in a wheelchair? Sure. What if I was blind? I can't honestly speak to it, but I know that I'm going to need voice recognition software. I'm probably going to need some sort of assistant in the classroom, right, as I'm teaching to you. I'm definitely, I don't know if voice recognition and software is going to do it all, but I might need my own TA. You know, I mean, I don't know, I'm just speculating. Reasonable or not reasonable? Okay, now I'm a small private liberal arts college with 700 students in northern Massachusetts. You see where I'm going with this? There is no line in the sand. It's a very gray area. So ADA is a powerful piece of legislation. Anybody in the disability activist world will tell you that it has paved the way significantly for disabled folks to work in the workplace with dignity, but that there's a lot of contusions in the law.
Well, it isn't the case of being hired. Wouldn't you still have to be able to, they didn't hire you, you still have to prove that you were more qualified.
Yes. Discrimination suits are not for the faint of heart on either side. You better have deep pockets if you're going into a discrimination suit or something on tape. You know what I'm saying? It's not for the faint of heart. Very, very expensive litigation. Okay, so I think for Tuesday, you should read chapter 1. I'm going to go down right now and put this in the library. We'll finish talking about chapter 1 on Tuesday. And then the homework for chapter 1 will be due on Thursday. And there's just a very few questions. There's no calculations in chapter 1. It's all discussion based. Okay? Have a great first week back. Welcome.